These spring onions, we sowed those on the 13th of January. So they're a month old now and ready to go into the ground. Now, these were multi-sown, and you can see there are several plants there. And that will give us our bunch of spring onions. Spring onions usually about 12 weeks before harvest. They've been in here for already, so it won't be too long before they make some onions. And I'm doing that so that we replace these as and when we use them. These were the ones that went in last September.
They do grow slower over the winter, don't they? So.
Yes, they do. We did overwinter these, but they really aren't going to be too long before we can start to enjoy them. These pak choi, they were sown at the same time on the 13th of January. And you'll probably notice, Mrs. W swings over, that we've finished eating those now, and we've replaced those with the radish that were also sowed on
the 13th.
The 13th of January. That's the 10 pak choi in. Now, what I ought to say is that all of those plants, if you remember, they were sowed in the fertile fibre compost. And it's done exactly what we want it to do. It's raised those plants, they germinated well. The compost didn't hold water so that they sat in pools of water. It just kept them nice and moist. So it's a real tick in the box. If I had to use fertile fibre, I would have no problems in using that compost, personally. Now, in today's programme, I have some peas to sow and some potatoes to plant. Hello and welcome back to the No Dig Norfolk Gardener. It's a great little job to do just to get those plants popped into the borders of the polytunnel. If you remember, I said that we were sowing those back then because we do have the benefit of this undercover structure. And it's still too cold. Weather's still too cold for any of these plants to go out into our outside plots. There's still many frosts to come, there's still a lot of wet weather to come, and certainly a lot of cold weather. You wouldn't necessarily think it today. It's a very mild day today. It's up to 15 degrees, hasn't it?
Hasn't it?
It really has.
Yeah.
So, but I do know that we are expecting some colder weather to come in towards the end of next week. But the question in today's video is all about the two peas. Literally the pea and the potato. How early can you sow or plant? Now we're going to start off by looking at the peas. If you're going to be sowing peas outside into your plots, the soil needs to be of a certain temperature, around about 10 degrees. Now, I can see by our thermometer in here that the ambient temperature in here is around about 10-12 degrees on most days. It was warmer earlier on today when the sun was really shining. Yes, it does get a bit cooler in the evenings, but this compost is not cold to touch. I always find one of the best ways to start peas off is in modules and undercover. I would advise that if you are going to be sowing your peas outside, then certainly wait until around March time, when the soil temperature will have warmed up. But even so, if I was going to be waiting until then, I'd still start them off in these modules first. Personally, there are other methods. I've seen people that sow them into old pieces of gutter. And then once they've got to the size they want, they just slide them into the trench. It's a good method, but this is the one that we prefer to use. Now, these particular modules you can see are a bit deeper than the ones we normally use. And that's because the peas do like to get their roots down. Any bean does. As soon as it germinates, it wants to send a taproot down. And also, we shall be using the peas that we saved from last season. We grow the variety alderman. I managed to save all of these peas.
You did well.
Now, we already know that going back a few months, Mrs. W dropped a few on the floor, didn't she? And they didn't all make it into here. And we thought, they're germinating. That's amazing. So I'm hoping that the germination rate is going to be really good for these home-sown peas. Time will tell, and you'll see over the coming videos. Because last year we had a real problem with peas germinating. I had to go and buy a whole new packet of peas, didn't I?
Yes, yeah, we did have a big problem.
So we thought, right, yeah, we're going to save our own this time around.
So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, Mrs. W. So we'll just make some divots into the cells. And we need about 80 plants. So I'm going to sow 2 at a time.
They are my favourite.
As I keep telling you, Mrs. W, they do need a bit of room to grow. These are large plants.
We don't have a lot of trouble with these. Once they get going, once we get them past the pigeon pecking stage,
Yes,
put them into the ground, then they're away.
they are indeed. As I said, these are a variety called alderman. And alderman can grow really tall, well in excess of 2 metres. And if you don't nip the tops out, they'll just continue going. But for the space that they take up, you get a bumper crop, don't you, Mrs. W?
Certainly do. Yeah, lovely.
We also grow ours over a pea arch. I find that a really economical way of using the space within our plots. We used to have them in rows, but they would take up a good 6 foot of the plot, and that space would be wasted until those peas were finished. So we've got our arch that straddles 2 plots, doesn't it?
Yes.
It goes over the pathway. If you haven't seen that, or you have seen it, because I normally film from there when I'm talking to you. So if you've seen that and wondered how you can make it, then do go back and check our video out, how to make a bean arch. We probably put that out there a couple of years ago, but it's within our playlist. In fact, I'll leave the link in the description so that you can click on that and watch that, because it really is a good economical way of using your space more effectively so that you can grow other things at the same time. As usual, we've just covered them over with some vermiculite and stand them in these trays of water for the next 30 minutes or so. Next, we're going to look at the potato. How early can you plant potatoes? Well, if you're planting them outside, and we plant most of our potatoes outside in the beds, certainly here in Norfolk, in our No Dig garden, we can't be thinking about putting these into the ground until mid-March. And that's because when you plant your potato, you do need to plant them about 3 to 4 weeks before your last frost date. Where we live in zone 9A. That means that our average last frost is mid-April. So we sow our potatoes mid-March, sometimes the week after. And I will have a look at the long range weather forecast before I do just set those in, just to see if there could be anything waiting around the corner that sort of the 7-day weather forecast doesn't tell us about. But you can plant them earlier. Now, if you've got a structure like we've got, a polytunnel or a greenhouse, in some places you could possibly get away with it in a cold frame, then you could plant your potatoes and grow them under cover, where they won't be subject to the frosty and cold weather. If you haven't grown potatoes before, if the frost gets them, it will set them back. And depending on the severity of the frost, it could set them back quite a few weeks. They'll need to regrow leaves and start all over again. Now, you could plant them into your borders, but we're not, because Mrs. W is not very good at getting all the potatoes up afterwards, let me tell
Don't
you.
you blame me. It's you who's not very good at getting potatoes up. You always harvest the potatoes, not me.
It's one of those things that however much you try and you think you've got every potato out of the ground, there's always a volunteer that pops up. Although it's sometimes annoying that they pop up within the plots outside, it's somewhat easier for us to be able to get those volunteers out just with a trowel and just lever them up and get rid of them. However, in undercover structures like greenhouses, polytunnels, once all the summer crops are in, they're quite tightly packed in to get the maximum harvest that you can get. And the last thing you want to be doing is fiddling around where a potato has popped up between your tomato roots. So, we shall be planting ours in these tubs. If you're a regular watcher of the channel, you've seen us use these before. Now, they have these drainage holes in so that water can escape, and that's important with potatoes because they don't like to be sitting in pools of water. Having said that, they don't like to go dry either, and it will limit the size of your crop. So if there is a downside to actually growing in tubs, it's that you've physically got to water them yourself and make sure that they're moist at all times if you want to get, a good crop out of these. Now, we'll leave a link down in the description where we got our tubs from, so that if you want to try this too, you can go and visit that and see where we got ours from. That's about the only disadvantage that I can actually see in growing in tubs, because there are lots of advantages. We should clearly be leaving them in here certainly until spring, late March. And if the days are warming up when we're not expecting frost, we can move those outside. And if we're expecting a frost, we can always move them back in. We're only going to have about 4 or 5 of these buckets just to get that nice early crop. Because the ones that we put out in our garden, which go out mid-March, first earlies won't harvest until right the end of May, tipping into June. And the second earlies, well, they won't harvest until July. So by doing 4 or 5 of these tubs, hopefully we get that lovely taste of new potatoes a full month earlier.
Fingers crossed.
And you know me, I can never wait.
No, you have no patience with new potatoes, do you, Barry?
No, you can't beat the taste.
No, you can't. That's very true.
Also, if you garden in a space where you don't have a huge amount of space, so that therefore you don't grow your own potatoes, these will allow you to do so. Because they don't take up a huge amount of space. They can, once there's no danger of frost, they can go down on your patio. They can stand in various places, up against walls, not a problem whatsoever. But equally, if you're gardening on an allotment, you've got lots of space, you can never have too many potatoes. And there'll always be little spaces where you can just drop a bucket down and let them grow away, and increase your harvest and your yields even more. Now, I've just got some of our homemade compost here, and I've just put enough in just to fill 1/3 of it. It's about 5 inches in depth. And then I'm going to plant 2 potatoes in the direction of these handles. And I'm going to cover them over and fill it a further third. And I'm going to plant that one right in the middle. I'm putting 3 potatoes in here because from what I can work out over the last couple of 3 seasons that we've been growing them in these tubs is that you need about 10 litres of compost to 1 potato. These are 30-litre tubs, so kind of guessing that 3 potatoes is the max we can grow in them. This is a variety called Rocket, and it's not called Rocket for nothing. It comes to maturity really quite quickly. We haven't grown Rocket for a few years now, have we?
No, we haven't.
I think it's probably one of the first ones that we ever grew, so we thought, well, I saw them there and I thought, yeah, let's give those a try in the tubs. Now you can probably see, actually before I cover these up, that these have been chitted. Our seed potatoes arrived at the beginning of January, so they've been chitting away since then. And it's just a question of letting those shoots get to about 2.5 centimetres long. They want to be in a cool but light place so that you get these dark shoots and not the white spindly ones that you often see in your potato sack when they've gone over. And by chitting, that potato's got a head start. It's already in growth. The stem has already got going. You don't have to chit. You can plant these potatoes without doing that, but they'll just take a little longer to actually come through the surface and start growing away. But we are chitters. Always have been, always will be. Do let us know in the comments. Are you a chitter or are you not a chitter? Actually, do you plant your potatoes in tubs? More importantly, do you plant them in tubs now at this time of the year to get an earlier crop? Have you tried that? Do let us know in the comments. Now, I've deliberately left a gap at the top. That will aid watering, so that it doesn't all flood over the top of the tub when we need to water them. But also, I want to put some straw on the top. We always have some straw about for the chicks. What that does do, that helps keep in a lot of the moisture once you water them, so it doesn't evaporate too quickly and you're not having to water them all of the time. They will need watering quite often once they get going. So that's those tubs with a good watering. It's a good session this afternoon, Mrs. W.
Yeah.
Managed to get those plants underway in the garden, and our potatoes are underway. So I've got another 3 of those buckets to do. Do have a great gardening week, won't you? And we shall see you on the next one.